Before we get started with our webinar tonight, presented by Stewart Lundy, I'm going to go over a few notes on Zoom, which is the platform we're using for tonight's webinar. For sound quality, for the recording, we'll begin with everyone muted. So you will have to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. And we'll have some time where there can be a space for questions and answers. And in the interim, we'll just like to ask if you have any questions that pop up, please jot them down so that we don't lose them. And we'll let you know when there's a space to ask your question. To raise your hand, you want to move your mouse to the bottom of your screen, which will reveal the toolbar from Zoom, and you'll click on Participant. Participant looks like a little silhouette of two people, and a dialog box will pop up to your right. And at the bottom of this box, there'll be an option to raise your hand, and you'll have to click it again to lower your hand. For those of you who are joining us by phone, to raise your hand, it's *9, and to lower your hand, it's *9 again. To unmute yourself, it's *6. And I can always unmute you when I call on you to ask your question. When I see a hand raised, I'll say, Amy, go ahead, and I'll go ahead and unmute you so you don't have to worry about that part. You can click the video camera icon on the bottom left of your toolbar, and this will alternate between turning on and off your video camera. We encourage everyone to have their video on, but if you're having any trouble with audio or connectivity issues, turning off the video will usually help. There's also a chat function that I think some of you have seen. That you're welcome to use, but the presenter won't be checking that during the presentation, but we can return to it during the question and answer portion as well. Now, I do want to ask, does anyone have any questions about Zoom before we begin? All right. I'm not seeing any questions. Let's check the chat box. Not seeing any questions there either. All right. Well, it's my pleasure to hand the floor over to Stewart Lundy. Stewart, will you get us started?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Stewart Lundy. I'm with Perennial Roots Farm in Accomack, Virginia. I founded it with Natalie McGill in 2010, and we've been growing out of what began as a garden and what began as kind of a homestead, developed further into something where we not only fed ourselves, but had surplus enough to supply markets. And anybody who's going to be focusing on a garden will probably be able to have a lot to gain from this, or from retooling, having to think about feeding themselves. We're having to change our business strategy entirely. The principles still apply, and I hope you find them useful. I'll probably go through this for about half an hour, and then we'll have a brief Q&A session, and then we'll go another half hour after that and close with another Q&A session. So there's time to interject questions. If you have any urgent questions, feel free to raise your hand or to ask in the chat, and specifically about clarifying what I'm saying. If you have a question about specific applications, we can save those for the Q&A. All right, so we'll get started. All right. So one thing from particular, this kind of agriculture is this idea of how we see problems, how we answer problems will depend on how we see agriculture. And in general, a lot of people are the thing
Stewart,
is to develop a space. And yes.
sorry to interrupt. I'm going to turn off your videos. I hope we can hear you a little bit clearer that way.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is that any better?
Let's try that again.
Okay. Is that any better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Good. All right. So how we answer problems will depend on how we see agriculture. And a lot of that comes down to whether we think of the farm as a living organism and what that really means. For me, it's not a metaphor. For me, it's something concrete. The first thing that I like to think about in terms of a farm as a living in and outside, and a semi-permeable membrane to separate those two worlds. It doesn't matter what scale that living being is, there's always that membrane. When you look at the soil, there is a living semi-permeable membrane of grass, vegetation that's able to breathe in certain things from the air to build new substances, but it also lets some things out, humidity through transpiration as it photosynthesizes. That's one of the first things to get together when crafting a space to be a microclimate. One thing I focus on a lot on the farm is making a space beautiful. There's a quote from Alan Chadwick that says, "We need to create the beauty first, and the quality will follow. The quantity will follow." And for me, that includes spaces for beneficials, pollinators, buffer strips. I always make a point of making the space you could almost call it therapeutic, but it's certainly much more relaxing to work in a space that isn't cluttered. Alan Chadwick also had something to say along the lines of dirty, filthy tools makes for dirty, filthy work. And there's something about keeping a space clean, really, it makes the work lighter. When you develop a small plot, and it doesn't have to be huge, you can create a real oasis that really is an empowering experience. Not only can you produce abundance on a very small space, but you are actually able to, with the attention you can give that space, improve it in many cases better than a 100-acre, 200-acre conventional farm that more carbon than some large-scale farm. So the idea that the smallholder or the individual is powerless against climate change, I actually would counter with, no, I actually think the individual is in many cases, the strongest force against this. And your backyard garden or small farm can be at the forefront of all of this. Nothing you do is too small. And this, again, is about scaling biodynamics so that it works for everyone. I'll read this quote, and it says that the farm actually fulfills its essence in the best sense of the word if it can be understood as a kind of individuality in itself, a truly self-contained entity. While a farm cannot ever fully realize this ideal, it should aspire towards becoming a self-contained individuality as much as possible. This is one of the most frequently referenced passages from the agriculture course by Rudolf Steiner. And the idea can seem a bit muddy, but not if we think of it as almost a microclimate. These aren't terms that Steiner would have used himself. The term ecosystem, for example, wasn't even coined until several years after Rudolf Steiner's death. And the term system sounds a bit sterile, and is probably not one he would have favored, but there's overlap in these concepts. We're trying to create a space that is resilient to the prevailing climatic conditions, which means you have crafted a microclimate. It is a diverse representation of a unique spot in the ecosystem, and that's how we build this. So having these concepts as kind of the groundwork for how we then approach building a garden and developing a space is really essential, or it can seem a bit haphazard. This is me harvesting some chamomile. And another quote. I'll try not to overload you with too many quotes, but I'll read this one for you. Paradoxical as it might sound, you will be able to do more the more you restrict yourself in regard to the area of land which you begin to cultivate in our ways. After all, if you go wrong on a small area of land, you will not be spoiling so much as you would on a large area. What Steiner's indicating here is not just that you can do more if you focus all of your attention to a small space, but there's a scientific element to it. If you start with a small area and treat that first, you will always have that as a point of reference to compare it with the rest of the land that hasn't developed as quickly. It'll always show you, oh, here's what the future will look like for that spot. So if you've applied biodynamic preparations, or you've given compost to a particular section, or you grew a cover crop in this area, you'll always be able to look at that as a point of reference for how the future of the rest of the space can be. So it's always best to give special attention to one area so you can always see that for the rest of the development of that space. This is a passage from Alexander von Humboldt, who is probably one of the best, least known traveling scientist, who promoted the idea of nature as this web of life. And he was so successful that we've pretty much forgotten him. It wasn't original to him. Other indigenous communities have had that concept long ago, but it was novel for, at least for European thought. He says here that wooded region acts in a threefold manner: in diminishing the temperature, by cooling shade, by evaporation, and by radiation. Rudolf Steiner even goes so far as to suggest that keeping trees near your garden will have an almost therapeutic effect for them. If you have fungal problems near your plants, having these trees that develop this thick bark full of tannins, simply being nearby will help treat those. And that's why in biodynamics we use oak bark, because of the tannin content and the calcium as an kind of an astringent property that really helps dry up plants and acts in this prophylactic manner. So considering these environmental factors, that's how we come down and are able to focus on the space itself. This is a hypothetical farm. Now, like this. This is the order to develop your garden or farm. This is not how it should look, but you'll often see this. If you're lucky enough to have animals on the place, you'll often have them locked in one section. The farmer drives in and gives them feed, hay, whatever it is. And this section keeps developing and keeps getting manure and becomes over-rich over time. Perhaps they collect some of the manure from a barn and take it here to the garden. And over time, this isn't balanced, but it's not as pronounced as using gigantic machinery, the sort that we use to make the Dust Bowl. This is the old world organic model where animals would be kept in one section, hay would be taken from somewhere else, and the garden would receive manure from the animals. It's lopsided, but it's not an accelerated imbalance, so you don't notice it. It takes generations for things to deteriorate. The first thing that we're missing here, though, is that living membrane to separate the land from the sky. And that's the first thing that has to be reinstituted here. The mere transition of keeping bare earth versus a living cover is that first step towards making this space a living organism, and not as a metaphor. It has to have that living, breathing skin in order to interact between these two worlds, in order to mitigate moisture, in order to dehydrate it if it's too dry, in order to hold moisture if it's going to be a long summer. This is the first thing. What I like to do in this place is to focus often on whatever season grasses tend to grow poorest, whether you get a really hot summer where most things tend to die out, or you get a cold winter where things tend to go dormant, is to focus on that season where things tend to die back and to seed with that. And you can end up with a perennially green space. Something I particularly like to favor is annual and Italian ryegrass, which lasts even into bitter colds that we can get here in the winters. And that's the first thing. That's how we get to that idea, is developing this first layer of skin. But it doesn't stop there. The next thing we do is develop a border to separate not just the farm vertically from the earth and the sky, but between the farm or garden and the adjacent ecology. These can be done, and depending on your scale, evergreens are particularly good blocking to the north if you're in the northern hemisphere, or south if you're in the southern. But whichever way the cold is, that's where you can put evergreens. There are Korean or just pine nuts. There are pine nut trees that grow in almost every zone, all the way from the Arctic, from the permafrost all the way to the equator. So there is a version of pine nuts that you can grow in even a relatively small space, that regardless of your zone, one variety will grow. As this develops, you create something that's more like a bowl, if you can imagine it round, and you're creating this almost parabolic mirror where the entire farm now is shaped in such a way that it is designed to catch sunlight, or catch starlight even, because plants don't really discriminate between the two. They photosynthesize with whatever light they receive. If you create this, then able not only to catch extra light, but when you have gases going off from the manure of the animals, they have to pass through this membrane of the trees. And the trees themselves will breathe in the extra carbon dioxide. They will breathe in methane. They'll even breathe in ammonia as nutrients. These are heavy gases compared to something like oxygen, and they will have to filter through the trees, and you will end up then circulating nutrients within the garden, within the farm. Not everyone here will be able to keep livestock, but even if you can't keep livestock, you can keep earthworms. Everyone can keep an earthworm bin, and that is probably the single best way to improve a garden, is to take whatever scraps you have and tend an earthworm bin. And a friend of mine, Rand Carter, will be able to speak to anyone probably about that if they're interested. He does a lot of that, and he's based in Florida. If we go further, you subdivide. In this case, if you're dealing with animals, I like to think of it as another crop. As you can see, we're not actually reducing the amount of productive land. If anything, we're increasing the productivity on the same space. Here, I like to choose things that have an affinity for the animals, like hazelnuts, which can increase the butterfat content of milk significantly just by the animals grazing on the leaves, or elderberries, which have this unique capacity to integrate ectomycorrhizae and endomycorrhizae, these two almost separate internets of the soil, if you want to use that concept. But it's able to plug together the field with the trees with the garden in a very special way. And I'll speak a little more about elders later, but this concept goes from the taller plants on the outside, and then it moves towards shorter shrubs on the inside, and then you have your open grasses and or garden in the middle. This should extend around the entire space. Whichever area you're getting sunlight from, you will almost certainly be dealing with shorter trees. But simply having this hedge to the north of even no more than 6 foot tall, it doesn't have to be huge. Ehrenfried Pfeiffer, who developed a lot of the early science for biodynamics, showed that it extends this blanket of warmth for over an acre-foot hedge to the north. What that does is it warms your soil weeks early and prevents hard frosts for weeks. So you end up having an extended growing season without having to do anything particularly special. Which I assume most of us are in this talk, is what Alan Chadwick claims as the single contribution of the English to gardening, which is pretty disparaging about his homeland. But these, he says, to pollinators. They should be aromatic herbs. So I would say lavender, rosemary, echinacea. I would add some annuals like tulsi or holy basil, and anything that produces these beautiful aromas. Calendula is a wonderful one, especially the ones with a high oil content. The reason for this is that this is part of the immune system of your garden. If you want to be combating cabbage moths, don't put this there. If you if you like having moths in your garden of any kind, even if they're the sort that eat your tomatoes, don't plant this. But what this does is, no matter what direction the wind's blowing, the wind is carrying a cloud of aromatherapy for the garden. These are essential oils which are loved by pollinators like bees and butterflies, but are shunned by most of the nocturnal species, many of which are our nemesis in the garden. This is an integral part of any garden. And there are many ways to introduce this. You can have alternating rows that are like this, but in particular, planting around the edge not only gives you this abundance of essential oils, it also makes it more pleasant to be there, but it's also habitat for mycorrhizal fungi. If this is a bed that is not disturbed, it's always able to grow back in and recolonize all of your disturbed beds if you have to use any amount of tillage. Here's an example of use. We have tulsi going by our tomatoes. Let's see, I'm getting a couple of questions. Someone asked about the list of aromatic herbs again. I will say rosemary, lavender. I like echinacea. I like calendula in particular. Just anything with a high essential oil content. And someone else also asked about the distance permitted for these aromatic herbs. And I would say, whatever the size of your garden is, I would put a periphery around it. If you're able to make a contiguous border, it will have the strongest effect, even if it's far away. The question, though, is whether you're, as close as possible, able to make a closed loop around it. And its distance is less important than the fact that you actually have essential oils wafting across the entire garden, no matter what. And the thing is, if you're able to smell it, the plants were able to smell it long before you, because the logic of these oils and the logic of these compounds produced by plants are meant for plants. We're kind of a secondary beneficiary of these, but the logic of them transfers directly to the other plants. They're able to breathe them in and use them directly. As you can see, we're able to get a host of benefits through here. We've seen more butterflies here than anywhere else on the shore, and we've got abundant wildlife here. But elders in particular are probably one of my favorites. The word itself comes from the word elder, meaning old age. And it's not an accident that we chose that word. Elder species are a keystone species in many ecosystems. Among many indigenous and folk peoples, it is said that the elder tree, quote, teaches the plants what to do and how to grow, and that without its presence, the local plant community will become confused. This is from Stephen Herod. And I think that's really an important point, that if a garden lacks certain keystone species, that's what scientists call them, but if they lack these elders, they're missing cues. They're almost missing a kind of inherited wisdom, and they basically all have to fend for themselves. Simply having plants like elders near your garden will send signals to the other plants and say, oh, rain's not coming. You guys need to hunker down and get ready. Don't transpire as much. It'll send signals. It'll even send reinforcements to species that do not belong to itself. And having these is just one of the best things you could do, either for an orchard or a way to bridge neighboring trees so that those are able to communicate with your garden. It's really, I cannot overemphasize the importance of elders. Really cannot. This is actually one of the few species that Aaron Fried Pfeiffer said makes the best compost. Simply building your compost pile near elders, they send their roots in and create a wonderful, wonderful compost. The quality is improved, so you're able to put this anywhere you need. Yeah, this is an example of some of the calendula we grow around there, and it's so oily that you touch one of these plants and your hands are covered with this sticky oil. But they're really wonderful. Just a sec. All right. Let's go. And this gets to Steiner's hint at the same idea that these neighboring plants help integrate with the layout of your entire garden. What Steiner says here is, as some sympathetic people benefit society merely by their presence, without words, by merely growing in an area, yarrow is a great benefactor as well. A lot of their dandelion, which everyone should be a big fan of these days, has many wonderful uses. They're great edible greens. They have more nutrients than just about any domesticated kind of kale or green that you can grow. But they also have a remarkable ability to reconcile certain elements within the soil in a way that benefits the entire area. But these are basic principles of what we're trying to attain when we design this garden layout in order to bring biodynamics into practice on a small scale. This is a picture of some mycorrhizal fungi with nodules growing off of it, and it's here that Steiner emphasizes that we're not just tending the space that we're tending. We're not just focusing on the garden where we want yield. We want to be focusing on the entire area around that and how it integrates into the surrounding environment. Masanobu Fukuoka talked about 3 kinds of farming. He talked about conventional farming, which is really out of kilter. Then he talked about Hinayana farming, which is you kind of save yourself and you do what you need and you fend for yourself. And then he talked about Mahayana farming, which is the great vessel, which is not just producing abundance for yourself, but doing it in a way that it spills over, your cup runneth over, and it helps the entire environment. So you're creating these spaces, these little biodynamic oases across the world, because when we finally do have to transition to a biologically minded, life-affirming form of agriculture, it's going to have to repopulate itself from somewhere. And it's going to be from these little pockets that might seem insignificant at the time, but they're going to come from there. When the neighboring fields surrounding us, which are constantly spraying biocides, finally stop spraying those, they're going to have to be repopulated with good bacteria and good fungus. They'll come from me, they'll come from this space, and they'll come from your garden. Steiner says here that if we manage not only forests, but also the medically effective for farming because they offer good habitat for fungi, you should ensure that the meadows are covered with toadstools. Almost every mushroom fruiting body that you'll see out in the field or in your garden, these are not things to try to eradicate. Almost all of them have some sort of mycorrhizal fungi. Some are saprophytic, and a few are parasitic, but most of them have a root relationship with another plant. And these developed from being primitive sort of parasites on a plant. And you can actually demonstrate how they still have this parasitic quality. They infect the roots. And if you show 2 sets of seedlings, one infected with fungus, the good fungus, and one not, the one that is free from fungus will actually grow faster for a while because the fungus is taking sugars from the other. But then once they reach a certain point, the one with the fungus explodes and goes beyond the other. The symbiotic relationship has rendered it an advantage over all other plants. That's why we need these fungal areas, particularly the perennials surrounding the garden, the herbaceous perennial border, in order to keep sending this back into your garden in order to colonize it. Almost all of your garden vegetables, with the exception of brassicas, are going to have a fungal relationship. So that's why we need to maintain these perennial beds surrounding the space. Even if you are just mowing your lawn and you make sure that's full of mycorrhizal fungi, you're already doing a lot of that work. Some of the best carbon sequestration and soil building comes from the sugars that pass into fungus, and those that the fungus is then able to make almost this crystalline lattice, almost like myelin sheaths, but ones that very slowly decay over decades in the soil. And that is what holistically about how the farm relates, how the soil relates to the sky, and how the farm or garden relates to its neighbors. All right. This gets to this fundamental ideas. Someone questioned about clarifying lawns and fungi. Grasses are really wonderful when it comes to mycorrhizal fungi. And I could actually, I'll quote Stephen Harabuner here. He even goes so far as to say, most grassland ecosystems are, and this is a quote, most grassland ecosystems are in fact dependent on the presence of psilocybic species for their health. These are mycorrhizal networks that basically double or triple the root surface area of every single plant they come into contact with, and they're able to mine phosphorus. So if you have a neighbor who is applying phosphorus fertilizers to their lawn, they really should be adding fungus, because if they add the good kind of fungus, the mycorrhizal fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi are able to trade sugars and mine the soil and pull up phosphorus for the plants. So these are ways to actually just reduce fertilizer inputs, as long as we know that that's what we're dealing with. But grassland is just one of the best ways to sequester carbon and to build soil, because the grass is sending sugar down into the soil, just keeps pumping it down there. And humus, good organic matter, is more than 50% carbohydrates. We don't usually think about it that way, but humus is predominantly carbohydrates, which is really, condensed sunlight. So the more we can emphasize and augment these photosynthetic surface areas, the more we're able to sequester. Someone asked, is it okay to incorporate mycofungi with a broad foliage of the lawn? The answer is absolutely yes. And I think we're nearing the 30-minute mark here, so I think this might be a good time to open up questions in case anybody has any so far, and then we'll be able to move on. The question session can last for 10-15 minutes. That's up to you guys, but I'll open the floor now to anyone who wants to ask. Don't be shy.
Hi, Stewart. This is Stephanie,
Hi.
and I the one who asked the questions about the lawn and the fungi, and someone responded that grassland is not the same as an American lawn. And I was just curious, like, if you think that adding mycorrhizal fungi to even a typical American lawn would increase carbon sequestration. That was where I was going with that.
Yeah, okay, yeah, absolutely. I don't know if I have the slide in this slideshow or a different one, because this is the first time I've given this particular talk in this way. I've unpacked this. So this is an original series that is different from my others. The answer is absolutely. They've done studies with mycorrhizal fungi in inoculated plants versus ones without it. And the ones that have mycorrhizal fungi actually fix 15 times as much carbon as the ones without it. And these aren't just like, Serengeti grasslands. This is just grass in general. It's amazing what they can do. Someone asked, sorry, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Someone asked about preparations to enhance fungi. I'm particularly fond of the 500 preparation. I'll have a slide about that a little later, but and animals are being fed roughage, which has lignin. One of the only things that can break that down one of the only things that can break that down is fungi or bacteria in the guts. And since it's cow manure, yeah, it's in there. But you're going to get fungus in the 500. It's just what happens. And you're going to get good fungus in there. There are several ways to enhance that, but I'm particularly fond of the 500, in particular, what is called 500 XP. 500 XP is 500 that has been stirred for an hour. The manure is stirred for an hour with shovels. Then it's inserted to the horns that's buried over winter. Once it has come out unearthed and transformed, to that is added all of the compost preparations. What is the final product is truly remarkable, and I'll show you a picture of what that kind of humus looks like after over a year just sitting in water. It's really remarkable. Someone asked about equisedum, and equisedum, its sulfur content is generally antifungal, but I've actually seen good results in terms of it stimulating healthy soil bacteria and soil microbes in general. It doesn't seem to have an antifungal effect within the soil microbiome. It does seem to have that effect on the plant surfaces, but those are very different kinds of fungus. Let's see. Someone asked here about where they can find plants or seeds like the calendulas I mentioned with high essential oil content. I would look at Adaptive Seed. They have one, this Adaptive Seed. They have a lot of really good organic and even biodynamic sources. They have one particular variety of calendula, which is I think called rosin calendula, if memory serves. These aren't in my notes, so I'm having to rely on my memory here. But those are wonderful. Like you pick one of the flowers, your hands are sticky. It's just full of such good oil. It's just such a wonderful plant. Someone says that they have a cleared piece of land that is pure dirt, and what I would suggest starting with. The first thing I would do is cover crop that as much as you can and as diverse as you can. A lot of seed mixtures will recommend 20 pounds an acre. I would actually recommend finding 20 different species and then applying each of those 1 pound per acre. So you end up with a maximum amount. Alex Podolinsky last year, and he developed a seed mix, which I think included upwards of 60 varieties. So the sky is the limit in terms of what you can pack into there, because every different root type will grow a different way, will unlock a different thing, and together you will end up with the fastest possible soil building. If you're on a small scale, I would use a broad fork to open the soil. And the best broad fork I found is the Meadow Creature broad fork. It's a tank. Yes, it's more expensive than the others, but it's welded steel and it's not going anywhere. I've had mine the whole time we've been here. It's amazing. You want to do what I would call mechanical loosening and then biological filling. So you loosen it, and then you can spray your biodynamic preparations. You can spread your compost, and then or you could sow your cover crop seed. But those cracks allow water to get down, it allows air to get down, it allows light in, and it allows those roots to chase the water down into those holes, and you'll end up with an accelerated improvement.
Stuart, we have a participant with their hand up. Would you be able to take a question? Martha?
Hi, this is Martha from Alabama, and we have a big problem with armadillos. We just put up a small fence around our garden, and so I would need to plant these perennials or these plants on the outside of the fence. Are there things that you know to be a deterrent to armadillos? They're very restrictive.
I do not have any experience with armadillos, so I have to be honest. I live far enough north that I haven't had to deal with that.
They're moving your way. They came our way. So, okay. But I really like the idea of the perimeter around the fence. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. There are certain biodynamic measures which can be used against that. I think it's the fourth session of this series. but that's specifically about that. I don't want to stray too far into pest management because I have a whole talk dedicated to that. If that's okay with you.
That's great. Thank you.
And someone else asked what I put in my orchard alleyways under trees on a large scale. Well, orchard grass is an obvious possibility, but that takes it's actually, I wouldn't even call it a beginner grass. That's kind of moderate to advanced just in terms of management. But one thing that Alex Podolinsky really emphasized about orchards is that you want to keep them mowed, which sounds counterintuitive, but as soon as a plant grows and then starts to flower and then it goes to seed, it stops photosynthesizing. Every time you graze pasture or mow it, you actually restart that life cycle. You restart photosynthesis. So if you want to basically maximize photosynthesis, build soil through your orchard, you actually want to keep it mowed pretty regularly. I don't mean too short. You don't want to hurt the grass. I set mine at about 6 inches and I'll mow it to that repeatedly through the year if I get the chance. I didn't this last year because I felt it was going to be a really droughty year. It was. I'm glad I didn't mow because it kept the ground shaded. But whatever you seed out should be knocked back so it stays in a vegetative state, because the fruit trees essentially are going to be absorbing the forces necessary to produce fruit. But if you allow the grasses to go to seed too often, they'll be the ones consuming that. But if you keep the grasses back in a kind of a leafy state, they really work as an extension of the leaves of the trees themselves, and they are sending sugars into the soil that the trees then can use for their own use. So there's many things you can put throughout the orchard. One thing I like to put under trees is stinging, to plant those all around the trees. It's a wonderful way to build soil. It's wonderful for the trees. It helps against aphids, just so many wonderful things. I have a couple more questions. All right, someone was asking about cover crops, mixture seeds. I would go to Green Cover Seeds. Green Cover Seeds, I think it's greencoverseeds.com. They have something that's called a Remix, I think, but Remix is cheap. Remix is actually, it's a whole collection of all their different cover crop seeds. It's whatever fell on the ground when they were sorting seeds. So they collect that, and you can get this on like for cents a pound. So it may not be the ideal mix, but it is the cheapest cover crop seed that you'll find. And you know what? The price is worth it. So it's a good way to start it. Someone asked about planting stinging nettles around trees. Yeah, I like to plant it, honestly, when I'm putting the tree in is a good point, because then as the tree grows, the canopy grows, so does this cluster of stinging nettles around it, which is always building soil. It shades the roots of the tree, and it's great against aphids. And you can just chop and drop it there, and that's great for it too. Someone said, and between trees and the land, what was I mentioning to avoid frost? If you have a windbreak to the north, even if it's no more than 6 feet tall, it will keep the acre to the south of it. It will protect it from the early frosts and from some of the late frosts. It'll warm your garden up weeks early, and it will keep them warmer for weeks later than normal. And the prevailing weather, you're able to, again, you're carving out this microclimate that behaves in a new way.
And it looks like Joyce had a question. I believe it might have comprised also of the question, do you have any suggestions for meadows that have a ton of invasive species? Joyce, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, hi, this is Terry, actually is my name. And I'm calling from North Idaho. And I had the question about my so-called meadow, which is made up mostly of invasive species. So that's one question. And the other question I had is, we've been building up the soil in the garden for a while, but there's been some inconsistencies over the years. So now the plan is to scrape back with a tractor, scrape back all the good soil into a pile down to the hard pan and put down hardware cloth and then make raised beds on top of it because we have gophers, and then bring back the good soil. So I don't know. I mean, I'm conflicted about it because it feels like a lot of disruption of the soil, but I don't know how. It's like because the work wasn't done to create a nice series of beds in the garden to begin with, now we have this other challenge. So anyway, 2 questions. I don't know if you can speak to both of them or not.
There's 2 parts to this. One part will be about whether it's okay to do that. And my first answer is yes. It's not, you can kind of think of it as you're basically going to be double digging your beds. And if, so you'll remove all that topsoil, that's fine. Put it under a tarp though, don't let it dry out. And when you do that, when you get down deep, if you're able to crack that with a broad fork, you'll actually have improved that entire space, even if you have to lay down hardware cloth.
Okay.
The ancient Chinese would actually grow in one spot over and over. When it started to not be quite as productive, they would remove all of the topsoil, carry it up into a shed, layer it into their compost, let that ferment. And while that's aging, they would, in that kind of ditch that they dug out of their bed, they would plant beans. And once the beans had gotten nice, full, and bushy, but before they've gone fully to seed, they would turn that under. And then they would go collect that basic composted topsoil and bring it back. And using that method, and then they composted everything, they were able to feed more people per capita than anywhere in the world other than Japan. So, and I think it's actually could be quite beneficial. You basically layer it. What I would do is kind of build a compost pile out of it and layer it heavily in between each layer. And you can bring in volcanic rock, cow manure, whatever, and basically treat this as a way of fermenting your topsoil in order to further unlock nutrients. And as for the gopher thing, I don't think it'll be of any devastating harm to put the hardware cloth in. Yeah, it's a lot of work. And again, in section 4 of this series, I will be addressing specifically dealing with targeted effects. But that really gives almost an alchemical thing. And there are remedies for that, but I don't want to get too much into that in terms of farm layout. I don't think there's any harm in doing what you're doing if you do it conscientiously.
Okay, great. Thank you. Helpful.
All right. Any more questions? We have room for one more. Invasive species. That could be its own talk. There are 2 sides to them. One is they're almost always taking hold of damaged ecosystems that are no longer intact. Like kudzu, it's always growing on the edges of woods, but we chopped apart what used to be millions of acres of contiguous forest. If kudzu had been introduced back before the Europeans arrived, it would have only found spaces on the outside of forests. So someone asked, do I have a book? No, but given COVID-19, I might have one by the end of the year. These invasive species, so a lot of them actually have a therapeutic medicinal property and they seem to correspond with the spread of other ailments. If you look at the chart of, say, Japanese knotweed, which a lot of people really despise, and I understand that, it's taking hold in places that were dominated by erosion, and it seems to be spreading where Lyme disease is strongest, and yet it's one of the best herbal Lyme remedies, which is it's remarkable. I don't know what to think of that coincidence, but it's there. It depends on what the invasive species is. If you're trying to get rid of it in order to then plant your garden, that's a different problem. Yeah, invasive species until they made your garden. Yeah. Like this ecosystem that's finished. It's always changing. A new thing's coming in, something else is moving out. This species goes extinct, a new one is born, but a lot of them come up. There are ways to kind of deal with this, I use a silage tarp on the garden, which is one of the best ways to manage weeds in my experience. I'll deep rip, I apply compost, I'll turn in whatever cover crop I had, I'll spray preps, and then I take a silage tarp over it. It does not make the soil go anaerobic, it does not bake the soil, but it acts as a cover that basically stops all the carbon from escaping and actually causes all the weed seeds to germinate, but then they die because there's no light. So I end up with an almost totally weed-free bed when I plant. And for garden scale, you don't need a lot. Someone asked about, most of our meadow field is low-grade hay that doesn't grow high. Any recommendation for livestock on that, or plant/orchard? Depending on where you are, I would look for a thrifty kind of scavenging heritage breed. And in my case, I chose a Gulf Coast native sheep. They're very thrifty. I would also look into, I don't get any money for recommending this stuff, so I would look at C90, or if you're worried about salinity, I would look at C crop. The protein content and even some of the poorest hay crops can really increase with the use of this, because it has all 90 non-radioactive trace elements, which really just amps everything up. Yeah, I silage tarp after soil prep, because then I've disturbed it, which I know means I've disturbed the soil and I've disturbed the seed bed. I tarp it then, which forces all of the weed seeds to pop up and die, and then it's like, it's just amazing. It's wonderful by doing it that way. It also helps the compost digest into the soil. By the time I pull the tarp off, there's nothing but earthworms under it. It's just great. All right, I think I'm going to proceed, if you're okay with that. All right. So this is a picture I changed the title of, but plants live by giving and animals live by taking. That's a quote from Goethe. And I think if we remember this idea, it makes a lot of this will make more sense. Plants live from an ongoing sacrifice of dying stars, and they sequester this sunlight. They draw it in. They breathe in light, really, is what you can think of. But plants do that in a way that animals and humans can't. They draw this in, and animals, when we eat, we destroy it. So what plants are able to breathe in, we destroy. So we always are living by taking. We can't avoid that. Hopefully we're taking less than the plants are bringing in every year. But that's the heart of this. And that's really the heart of rotational grazing. That's why mowing can be beneficial, as long as you're not over mowing. And that gets to this diagram I made this animation to kind of show the stream of carbon as it passes. If you look at trees, a lot of people love trees. I love trees, but they're not the champion carbon fixers. Their leaf litter will fall down, it settles on the bottom, and then it very readily evaporates back to the tree. It's a very short cycle. If you dig in a forest, after about 4 to 6 inches, you're going to hit soil that has virtually no organic matter. The deeper you go, the less there is. If you go out to pasture land, you're going to find the opposite. The top layer will seem relatively poor in organic matter, but the deeper you go, the more why grassland, in combination with trees, will have the best cumulative effect. You don't want one without the other. You need both. So if you watch this path, these are the journeys of carbon here. Here from the manure, it goes away. Here from cow farts, it goes away. From here, the leaves, it evaporates. There are these peculiarities in cows called hooves and horns, where what might have been emitted or diffused deflects back in. It deflects back in and recirculates within the cow. When you do an aerobic compost pile, yeah, a lot deflects back in, but you're also losing some. You have to remember that. Anytime we till, we are going to lose something to the air. That's why we have to give back more than we take. And that's really, there's something, I think the poet Schiller wrote that if you want the highest and grandest, look at the plant. What the plant does automatically, you have to do willingly, volitionally, deliberately. Here, we watch the process as these plants bring down carbon and they push it all the way down into the soil, where that's this micro-aerobic region. It's not quite anaerobic, but it's not really aerobic either. It's this very slow decomposition. And trapped down here, that's why carbon can stay for a very long time, unlike here, where it just goes back up to the sky. This is going to get to the cow horn. This is central to biodynamics, and if you haven't heard about it yet, you will. You might get sick of it, but this is our thing. The cow horn is really an extension of the sinus cavity. A lot of people don't realize that it is not a weapon. It's really, for you and me, it's like our cheekbones. It's an extension. It's how we smell things. When the cow is chewing something and ruminating, she is actually smelling her food, and these scents deflect and reflect back inside. This is how she contemplates how she's digesting. This is how her nervous system sends signals to her gut to tell her how to digest. She's not consciously thinking about it in the way that you and I might think about the food that we're eating. In fact, she has more neurons in her gut than she does in her brain. Her salivary glands are actually bigger than her entire brain. She is almost entirely designed for digestion. But this process here is what we're trying to create when we're making a farm or a garden as a microclimate, as a living organism. We want these odors to be able to deflect back inside, because odors are nutrients escaping. Joel Salatin wrote that the smell of manure is the smell of manure mismanagement, which is an excellent, very American way of saying something that Steiner also said 100 years prior, which is that a living organism must stink inwardly. If you've ever handled a live chicken and then handled a processed chicken, they're radically different in terms of how your hands will smell afterwards. That kind of meat hand smell, that is what should stay circulating within an organism. So when it comes to compost, when it comes to scent, all of that should be deflected back within the organism. That's what we're doing, not openly rotting or smelling. And it doesn't mean beautiful odors of like pheromones and plant smells and essential oils. Those are scents, not stinks. All right, so Steiner says here that the right balance of forests, orchards, shrubs, and meadows with such a natural mushroom culture is so much the essence of good farming that you can really achieve more for a farm, even if you have to reduce arable land somewhat. So even if you're planting some perennials, and maybe you're technically reduced, if I'll recommend John Jevons' approach, because you can get, which is the grow biointensive method, you can get an incredible amount of yields, and it is entirely harmonious with the biodynamic approach, in my opinion. This quote is relevant to whether or not you will have livestock below ground. You are going to be tending pill bugs, earthworms, dung beetles, all of it. That is your livestock. That is who you tend. Whenever an animal consumes a plant that is particularly rich in such cosmic forces, the animal, out of its own particular organization, produces the most suitable manure for the soil on which that plant grows. And this is why everyone should be tending earthworms, especially if they don't have any other livestock. It is a wonderful way to process your excess. But in addition, Steiner says that these earthworms have this ability to leave behind the perfect ethericity or vitality necessary for plant life. They're able to reduce any excess that would have led to kind of disease problems that a plant overrich this neutral just vitality that is unrivaled, really, really unrivaled. Of all the preparations, there are two that stand out. I use them all, but if you don't have access to them all and can only, say, have access to two, start with those two. Mae Bruce, who wrote Common Sense Composting, which is a free book. It's available online. It's out of print. She wrote that the two essential ingredients are yarrow and nettle. The others are used because of their prophylactic qualities, but if unattainable, any one of them may be omitted. In this case, her recipe comes down to a compost starter, which uses yarrow and nettle and water together with honey, and you let that ferment for 24 hours, and you can use that to colonize your pile. It is not as thorough as the full spectrum of biodynamic preparations, but it's in that direction. I strongly recommend either that, or if you're able to grow it yourself, use what's on your land. I think that is the best thing you can do. The best medicine is in your garden, not something you bought in. If you have these plants and you can use them, those should always be in your compost pile. There's really nothing better than them. Speaking of pill bugs, let's look at this diagram. So when you have a compost pile and you have maggots show up, that means that odors have been escaping. It's too wet, it's too heavy. And that means that the flies have smelled the odors, which means the nutrients you're already losing, and they show up. They should not be able to smell it. If you have a sandy soil or really light soil with a lot of air in it and warmth, you're going to have pill bugs. From what I've read about pill bugs, and this is shared somewhat with earthworms, is that they have this capacity to chelate or bind heavy metals. And it's still in the soil, but they're put out of circulation. They're not reactive. Your plants aren't going to absorb them. So they still have a beneficial effect. When you're building a compost pile, you want this middle zone. If you have a heavy soil that's heavy, wet clay, you're going to want to move towards this. You want to lighten it. If you have a light soil, you're going to want to make it heavier. But in terms of balancing your compost pile, this is what you're after. If that makes sense. And I hope that addresses the pill bug question at the same time. So we look back at this picture. This is really what we're trying to do, and this is what we're trying to do not just on the farm. This is what we're trying to do in the compost pile. We want to create this membrane that goes around it. And so what I like to do is layer soil, like our friend earlier talked about in terms of moving an entire bed and taking out the topsoil. You want to layer topsoil through every time you add some new material to your compost pile. It doesn't have to be a lot, but Aaron Fried Pfeiffer wrote that it should be between 5 to 15% of your compost pile. The sandier your soil, the more topsoil you should put in. The heavier your clay, the less you'll need to. But this works as a kind of biofilter. So as these odors and nutrients would want to escape up and out, they're deflected back and they're caught. They're filtered by basically the holding capacity of this biological soil that you put in there. And that's really what we're after. This image goes and applies to all of this. On the left is compost that looked like compost to the naked eye, and on the right is finished compost. You can still see that there's parent material here, like straw or something. There's some bits of finished compost there, but what we're really after is a kind of compost that has been reduced to colloidal anonymity. Like a colloid is something that is so small, it's microscopically small, that it no longer obeys what we think of as the conventional laws of physics. It's not bound by gravity. It's actually more attracted by what's called nuclear force. It is more attracted by just the atoms around it than it is to the earth. So we're creating a very different kind of substance when we reduce it to that. I'll show you what that looks like here. This is often what compost comes looking like. And it's the legal definition of compost in the United States. And yet it's not compost. It is deodorized manure, but you can see it's got parent material, it's got wood chips in it. It's perfectly good to add to your soil. It's not this. It's not that quality. When you get it to this, real miracles start happening. And that's really what we're after. In biodynamics, in terms of soil building, we are after this kind of stuff because you're increasing the surface area when you break this down. This has massively more surface area in order to hold biology, fungus, everything you can possibly think of, nutrient availability. The plants can discriminate. They can choose. This is like a buffet. There's not a lot. They can try to eat some little pieces in between here, but the bulk of this has to decompose over years. In permaculture, there's this idea called the edge effect. You can make a pond that's a circle, and it holds a certain volume of water, or you can take the same volume of water and make these wiggly lines. And this has 2 to 3 times the surface area, which is really remarkable. The same thing applies when you compare clay to humus. In 1 tablespoon of good clay, you can have 20 acres of surface area. But in 1 tablespoon of humus, you could have 3 times that. When you're able to create this kind of surface area in the soil, the things that start happening biologically and energetically are radically different than what you've ever seen. Bill Mollison liked to talk about how a grown full chestnut tree has something like 60 acres of leaf surface area. It does, and that's really cool. But you know what? So does a tablespoon of good finished humus. So when you think about it like that, you're able to create all of the diversity that is apparent to the eye in a chestnut tree in 1 tablespoon of good finished humus. Now, the stimulating effect of something like that, you only need to use in very small amounts because it's pure magic. So here's a picture that I took at Hugh Courtney's place, Earth Legacy Agriculture in Woolwine, Virginia. On the left is what is known as 500. Undergone the thing that happens when a cow is smelling. It doesn't allow any of the odors to escape, and it forces them to digest and redigest, and finally, click, they're all fixed. And you end up with an odorless, beautiful colloidal substance. This, on the right, is 500 XP, or 500P. This was, I believe, an innovation of Alex Podolinsky, which was to add all the compost preparations to the 500 manure. And I think it was just due to how Steiner said something in passing. He says, and to the manure we add, and then he lists the different compost preps. So that's what's happening here. This has been a year. You can see these started the same size, the same weight. This one has diffused significantly. You can see it's darkened the water, whereas this one, it hasn't, and this one has maintained its shape. This is because humus is more attracted to itself than to the universal solvent water, which is truly amazing. For this to sit underwater without rotting or losing its structure or dying is really unthinkable. This is the level of soil improvement that nobody really thinks about. But if you were to start with a preparation on your field, I would start with this one, because 500 is awesome, but the 500 with the added compost preparations, it's really not that much more expensive, but it goes a lot further. This is how Alex Podolinsky was actually able to increase his soil organic matter from less than 0.5% to over 12% in less than 6 years. And he used no compost. If we're able to do that, then what the scientists estimate about natural rate of topsoil formation is just wrong, which is great, because that means that we can make soil faster than they think we can, which we need to do these days. If you were to do that, I recommend finding a source of horns. If you can get it from Brian Wickert, and he's in Brian Wickert, and really only need a few horns. 1 horn is enough to treat an acre. I would find the best manure you can, the most grass-fed, organic, and local, grown on in the same climate or in the same soil if you can, and but don't be dogmatic about it. It may not be absolutely perfectly biodynamic. It may not be totally organic. Maybe they worm once in a blue moon, but you can ask them. And then you can choose a judicious moment to collect that. And once you put this in the horn, I like to bury it under the compost pile, because Steinert says to bury it in a place that is rich in humus and not too sandy. And what's a richer spot than under your compost pile? In addition to that, you won't lose it. It seems to be a biodynamic ritual that people lose the horns that they bury, and I'm all about breaking that ritual. A good way to do that is to bury it under your compost pile. Someone's asking about an alternative for vegan biodynamic friends. There is a document online, I believe, which is about vegan versions of the preparations. And Maria Toon also had some vegetarian alternatives, which she only had to do because of the mad cow lockdown, and they weren't able to get any of the leftovers of any animals. The trick with the horn is that if you want the free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria in it, you're going to need a protein source. And keratin is a very good source for that. And I know of no ruminant manure alternative for doing this particular function here. All of the other herbs, I can. Brian Wickert is the source for horns. The Josephine Porter Institute, or Earth Legacy Agriculture, larger scale. Earth Legacy Agriculture really only does larger orders. Josephine Porter will do, they have ore and everything. And they both have very good quality stuff. But you're able to make this yourself. And if you're able to grow it yourself, something that's become popular lately is this idea of indigenous microorganisms. Of course, the ancient Chinese did it, the Koreans did it. Everybody used to do this. We're only coming around and rediscovering the idea again. So if you're able to do this on your own farm, or garden, I strongly recommend it. You'll have created something that is especially suited to your place. And that is how I would approach regenerating a new space and making it into this characteristic microclimate, this living organism. You deal with the layers of the skin from the inside to the outside. You start just getting the dirt covered, and then you build your periphery, and then you move inwards. And this is how I would approach it, and I hope that's useful. I think we can open it up now, probably, if my timing is correct, to additional questions. Someone did just share a comment with me, and from Maria Toon, and this is accurate, and I'll quote it. It says that plants cultivated for several years with only vegetarian compost increasingly lost their capacity to develop fully, failing, for instance, to develop a full head of cauliflower or lettuce. This is because of a lack of what could be called animal energy or astrality. There is a way to bypass that. If you do not want to use animal manure or animal parts, but you still want to get a nice full head of cauliflower, you know, the flowering parts of things, or big fat lettuce, you need to bring in something that has those astral influences, so to speak. A good way to do that is with weeds, particularly the weeds that you don't like. Wonderful things to compost, they bring in an element of that. Whereas if you're only building a compost pile out of leafy things, you're just going to get leafy growth. And you need to bring in something that has that flowering aspect. I hope that helps. Someone asked here, do you make your compost pile in one go, or do you build over time? I build over time. And what I do is if I do have to weed, ideally I don't have to. Last year I barely had to weed because I strategically used the silage tarp and the biointensive approach, which is I've killed the weed seeds originally. I plant out everything really close together, and then I hoe around the plants maybe 2-3 times, and then the plants shade their roots and everything around them, and the weeds don't have a chance. I build it over time, and when I do have to weed, I carry a bucket, and I put all the weeds that I pull in the bucket, so they don't even have a chance to wilt. And then you take that bucket and you pour that on your compost pile and take a shovel or two of topsoil, or even have to dig around the pile just to toss them up there and cover that over. Someone asked, do I suggest 3 different compost piles? Can you further clarify that? I'm going to answer a second question. If you could write a follow-up, why are you asking if I were to suggest 3? I need some more context on that question. I'll answer another one though. Someone's asking, what role do native mosses play in a biodynamic garden? Moss has this amazing capacity to dissolve rock. And if you've ever been anywhere that has moss growing on the rock, you can actually peel the moss off of the rock and look underneath it, and you will find grains of sand. The moss is actually dissolving the quartz that it's on top of, and it's creating new soil out of that. All plants have that capacity to dissolve parent rock if they are made enlivened and vital enough. The trick is to move them in that direction. Moss is a wonderful compost ingredient. If you don't want it, it's great. Wonderful to add to that. These kind of air plants or very simple plants like mosses. Aaron Fried Pfeiffer wrote that Spanish moss is one of the single best things to add to your compost pile. It's able to draw what it needs in from the air and from the rain itself, which is just incredible. Follow up, here it is, the 3x3x3. Curious about building over time. Pfeiffer indicates that you need 3x3x3 to get heat, and not a problem for you to produce humus. Once you build a pile up to a certain size, it can then start to generate its own heat. Or if you built up to a certain size and then you turn the pile once, it will generate its heat. Also, the less that you turn a compost pile, the more fungal dominant it will be. And again, you want good fungus for everything except brassicas, basically. Someone says that they have a bathtub of horse manure, not sure how to incorporate it or use it. If the manure has been aged, I would spread that out over your pile. It's something that I would broad fork, spread the manure if it's been aged at least somewhat, and incorporate that, and then put a silage tarp over that until it is fully digested into the soil. And then you'll probably be pretty okay. Someone asked about barrel composters. I strongly advise against those barrel tumbling composters. They don't work the way they advertise. You're losing a ton of material because it's never able to get enough thermal mass. They can be very messy. I strongly recommend against them. A silage tarp looks like impermeable black on one side and white on the other. If you look at Farmer's Friend silage tarp, they have different sizes. And these are originally not even used for this purpose, but they work wonderfully for it. It's all UV stabilized. I strongly recommend building your pile in one place. If you have a problem with vermin, it's because they smell something escaping from it, which means the pile wasn't built correctly. If you keep layering soil, so that basically you shouldn't be able to see whatever you added every time you add it, and you cover it with an old rug or an old blanket. But if you have vermin or if you have maggots, it was a problem. Someone asked about truckers' tarps. Yeah, that probably works too. I don't know what they're made out of, but whatever will do the job. I think even Steiner was asked a question which didn't make the cut for some of the English translations, but that he was asked about tarping, and he said, yeah, it's fine as long as it's not left on there too long. But for some reason, it didn't make the cut in the English translations that I've read. Someone's asking here about the preference for ground cover around raised beds. We're in a new home and the garden is all mulch. Trying to decide whether to replace that with ground cover. If someone is focusing on a garden that is kind of the back to Eden approach, which is using a ton of wood chips, over time you're gonna end up with a potassium excess. This can be mitigated by bringing in some form of manure or phosphorus, even if it's just soft rock phosphate. But I would make a point of, if you're using wood chips, to use rock dust or azomite, something to layer in between those. Every time you add new wood chips, add something like rock dust or azomite. If you're thinking about a walkable ground cover, you might consider, there's, I think, a creeping thyme or oregano. What is it, thyme or oregano? I can't remember. Creeping thyme or oregano? Sorry, my brain can't remember, but there's a very low growing aromatic herb that you can trample every day of the life. There it is, it's time. So you can trample it every day of its life and it just keeps growing. And guess what? It's also an aromatic herb. So you're introducing that whole idea of the perennial herbaceous border, but through your paths as well. And you're tracking it everywhere you go. Someone asked, does barrel compost expire? It's tricky. You'll actually notice something over time if you keep it long enough and you have a sandy area, is that you'll find sand settles to the bottom because the preparation is alive, it's moving, it's digesting, and as it's moving and shifting sand relative to the size of colloidal, tiny, tiny, tiny pieces of humus, the sand's like boulders and they sink to the bottom. It's just a fascinating process. If you keep it well, I see no reason that it has to expire. You just have to keep it well. That's the problem. Is, does it dry out and become desiccated? If it turns to powder and cannot reform into a nice clay ball, I would say it's spent. And it will have some effect on the garden, but it will not have the same stimulating effect anymore. I don't have a seed source offhand, but I am sure that it is out there, and you should be able to find it if you Google that. Someone asked about mixing manure with hay and pine bedding and / dust. The problem with mixing manure with pine straw or dust, the dust is almost better because it decomposes faster. The smaller, the faster it will decompose. Otherwise, you end up with a really high carbon substance, and it's barely manure anymore when you have it full of wood chips. But the pine dust is a lot better. It's so much faster. I think it's fine to do. It's just you have to think about when you get what is technically called horse manure and it's got a ton of wood shavings in it. Sometimes you're not getting any nitrogen benefit. You're actually you're adding carbon, which can be fine too if it's thoroughly digested. Let's see. Any books or resources for further reading? So what do you want to read about particularly, I guess is the question. I need specifics. Sorry, I've read everything. If it's further about soil or like how some of this stuff works, I would look to The Secrets of Fertile Soils, which is from Acres USA. That one's very good. It turns out by the end, it actually has a biodynamic angle, but it gets into some of the nitty gritty, even the scientific aspect, if you're into that, of why this matters and why earthworms love root hairs, and that's their favorite food. As the plants slough them off and grow new ones, the earthworms eat the old ones. And that's why if you can stimulate root hairs, which the 500 preparation absolutely does, you will get more earthworms. Like it's this whole cycle there. So depending on what you want to learn or what you want to know, if you can further specify what theme you're asking about, I can make a recommendation absolutely. I hope this was interesting. Here's something. Someone wanted to suggest Pfeiffer field spray to break down wood chips, leaves, horse manure. They don't have. I would say that using the Pfeiffer field spray or the 500 XP, which is not that different, either one of those would work. The Pfeiffer field spray is really easy, and anybody can use it, and you don't have to do a whole hour stir with it. Suggested books for beginners that don't have formal training in horticulture and biodynamics. I would look to Maria Toon. She has several books out there. One is 101. I think it's 101 tips for the gardener or homesteader, a small scale sort of thing. It's wonderful. Great pictures, great instructions, a great process. Pfeiffer as well has some very good introduction books. Sorry, Aaron Freed. I like a lot of these. Those are some of my favorites. Maria Toon, whatever you can grab by Maria Toon is excellent. Pfeiffer gets to be a bit more scientific, but Maria Toon's books are beautifully illustrated, simply informative. I've read every biodynamic book I can get my hands on in English and some outside English, but Maria Toon's works I still draw off the shelf, 10 years later, which is that really speaks well for them. Storrell's book is it's intense, it's comprehensive, but it is also a solid book. So, any other questions? Someone has to follow the moon cycles with planting or harvesting. I do follow, particularly with the moon cycles, and I do use a biodynamic calendar. I like, again, sorry not to sound like a broken record, but I like Maria Toon. The Stella Natura one I also like. And then there's the Celestial Planting Calendar that I think Hugh Courtney helped consult with. That one has a bit too many blackout dates for me. And as a farmer, I can't take into consideration every blackout time that the Celestial Planting Calendar adds. It's just impossible. I have to pick almost every day. And then I can adjust sometimes if there's a few hours that's considered inauspicious, but I honestly can't use the Celestial Planting Calendar. There are too many hours that are just taken out of my day. But the Maria Toon one I am able to use for the most part. And there is a particular, I can't remember, I think it's the third in this series where I specifically get into the calendar. I've noticed most the effects of the moon, but I am very low. I'm right by the ocean. It's very humid, and that watery element is dominated by the moon. The biggest thing you will notice first in terms of germination is if you are able to soak seeds and keep them moist about 48 hours before the full moon and keep them moist, you will have things pop up that will just astonish you. Things that should have taken weeks will be up in a matter of days. That's the first thing, and that's something that anybody can try, but you'll find germination rates work much better right before leading into that full moon. But I use the Maria Toon calendar, and I think an Earth Day is a great day to start everything because the root is the first thing that every single plant puts off. Yes, you can tend it the rest under the flower, fruit, or leaf, or whatever it's going to be, but again, I'm having to plant all the time and start seeds almost every day, so I have to think about it. But what it ends up doing for me is I use the root. I can start anything, and I can transplant anything. And then I can actually do it on the correct leaf, fruit, flower, organ day as well, which gives me actually half of the month is appropriate. Ideal to 10 things on fruit days, but that's a bit further. There's another question. Any particular preps for use in the orchard / tree border, and also for those aromatic plants. So I would particularly use, I would like silica on those borders and for those aromatic plants. If you can increase photosynthesis, you're going to increase the essential oil content. But my favorite preparation is the one from nettles. And it's pure nettles. You can bury it in a clay container for a year and you dig it out. Aaron Treat Pfeiffer found that stinging nettle preparation was the single preparation that consistently improved flavor and yield. And you might be able to attribute that to the fact that stinging nettles has, over 16 amino acids, including all the essential amino acids, which is a wonderful contribution to anything you might try to be stimulating. In addition to that, any plant that grows near stinging nettle will have a much higher oil content. Rosemary that was grown near nettles actually can have about 2 to 3 times as much oil just by growing in proximity to nettles. But nettles is one of my favorites. It's hard to overdo. But silica, nettles, equisetum, those are 3 that I use a lot of, particularly around the periphery. Someone asked, how do I start my seeds? I use open flats. I built cedar boxes with gaps on the base so that the water could wash through. I like cedar for various reasons, but I like to have them in open flats because the roots can grow together. And if you do a trial of the same amount of plants, the same amount of soil, and then you place them, you grow them side by side, you're going to find that the one in the open flat where the roots can all touch will be better. Yes, you will have to cut the roots, which you should do 24 hours before you transplant so the plants have time to recover. But the plants have kind of developed this quantum link and they're much, much healthier by the end of it. Someone asked how I start my seeds. Well, now I have a fodder system that's automated, and I have a 200-gallon vortex machine that I built that keeps water stirring all the time. I put preps in that. I put system once every hour with vortex water. And I use that chamber now to germinate my seeds. If you're able to make a germination chamber, you will get, and you can use an old refrigerator, even an old small refrigerator. That's all you need, and a thermostat and a little heater. You will get nearly 100% germination all the time. I have had, this year in particular, the best germination rates I've ever had in my life. And yeah, I'm using good water. That helps, but so does the integration with everything else I'm using. Someone said, so horsetail to add silica. Horsetail is great. Yeah, if you're going to use horsetail as a remedy, you need to simmer it covered as a decoction for about an hour. And then if you let it sit aside, probably outside or in a shed, covered with like a cheesecloth or something so flies can't get in, let it ferment for 10 days. You can spray that on your squash, and if you use it consistently, you won't have any powdery mildew. It is really remarkable. But I like that around the periphery. I like that on anything you really want to increase photosynthesis with. Silica increases photosynthesis, increases drought resistance, increases flood resistance. It's really a power horse. All right. Anything else? Yeah, thank everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm glad it was such a good turnout. I hope everybody really enjoyed this. Again, I'm doing 3 more of these through the Biodynamic Association, so feel free to check those out too. It will be none of this information. I don't even repeat one slide in all 4 of the slideshows. So I make a point of that, so I won't bore you, hopefully. Someone did ask, can you over ferment the horsetail? My answer is no. But if you do reach a point where it seems to be biologically inactive, just boil some more and pour it in. It'll wake right back up like a fire. Someone's asking if the slides are available. Let me, I will send the link here, just a sec. I will paste it again so people can see it. Hold on here, just a sec. All right, here's the slides, and the recording will also be available on the Biodynamic website.
Yes. Thank you all. Thank you, community, for joining us tonight. I'll be sending the video recording along with a quick survey to hear more about your experience in email tomorrow. I do want to share that the second part of this 4-part series will be on Tuesday, April 28th. I hope you'll consider joining us then. And thank you again. And thank you, Stewart, for leading us in this work.
Yeah.
Much appreciated. I'm going to go ahead and unmute us all so we can have a goodbye together.